Hello, Sean Munger here, That History Guy, and welcome back to the Bond in Context video series, where we investigate the historical context of the James Bond movies. We started back in 1962 with Dr. No, and now we're up to the 80s with the 13th Bond film, Octopussy, released in 1983. Just a word of explanation here. There were technically two James Bond pictures released in 1983, Octopussy starring Roger Moore and Never Say Never Again starring Sean Connery. The latter film was kind of a rogue production. It was a remake of the 1965 film Thunderball, which I've already done in this series, and it was made by different producers than the usual Eon Productions team, which was headed by Albert Broccoli. I'm not going to do a separate video on Never Say Never Again. We can cover the historical context of that movie fine just here because it obviously came out at the same time. I confess I don't like Never Say Never Again very much, and not just because of Sean Connery's ridiculous toupee. Granted, Roger Moore's in Octopussy is not much better. Moore was 55 when he made the film, but I'll talk about his casting in a moment. But we're not going to cover Never Say Never Again. I think we can do the job we need to do here in this video. Octopussy was made 10 years after Live and Let Die. As you recall, I noted that Live and Let Die pretty much refused to embrace its own historical context, what was going on in the world at the time it was being made. By contrast, Octopussy is one of the most topical films in the entire franchise, and it embraces world events and the political and cultural moment of its making probably more than any of the other Bond films do. Octopussy is mainly about two things, which are heavily intertwined: nuclear weapons and the Cold War. The film has an almost incomprehensible plot. It's so muddled, you can't figure out what the hell is going on. But the main thing involves a Soviet general named Orlov, portrayed by British playwright Steven Berkoff, and he's your classic Napoleon and Hitler-like power-hungry conqueror. In fact, Berkoff, the actor who played Orlov, eventually played Hitler in the TV miniseries War and Remembrance, probably one of the most manic, foaming-at-the-mouth portrayals of Hitler ever put on film, but I digress. Anyway, Berkoff's character wants to take over Western Europe. In a truly audacious and amazing scene, unique in the entire Bond franchise, we see the interior of the Soviet military war room, where Orlov tries to convince his commie cronies to go along with his plan, which is basically to flood Europe with tanks. The objection to this plan is that the NATO alliance will counterattack with a nuclear strike. Though the script could be a lot clearer on this point, the fulcrum of the plot is that Orlov has to figure out a way to get NATO, the United States and its Western European allies, to remove their nukes from Europe so as to remove the objection of the Soviet leadership to pursuing his plan. Clear as mud, right? Well, this is an uncommonly Byzantine plot for a James Bond film, but notice what we've got here. The villain in the last film, For Your Eyes Only, is a spy working for the Soviets. Previously, the Bond series has been pretty reluctant to identify Russians and communists as the enemy. Where a Bond villain does have ties to the Soviet Union, like Rosa Klebb in From Russia with Love, the Soviet identification is usually incidental. The villain is usually moonlighting for some non-communist organization like Spectre, which is never portrayed as having any particular ideology. Octopussy, though, pulls out all the stops in painting the Russians as villains. That's an explicitly Cold War context, and the film expressly sets up the U.S. military, and particularly American nuclear weapons deployed in Western Europe, as the one backstop that prevents a red communist tide from sweeping all over Europe. What I just described is exactly the geopolitical worldview of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, both of whom were at the height of their power in 1983 when Octopussy came out. Reagan was a hawk, constantly warning about the threat of Soviet aggression and expansion. This was the central idea of his presidency, in fact. Raise the defense budget dramatically, counter Russian aggression with the threat of military force, hard power, And Thatcher was down with this idea because it meant the preservation of what little was left of the British Empire. The year previous to the release of Octopussy in 1982, of course, Margaret Thatcher had presided over the Falklands War, in which Britain fought a military conflict with Argentina to preserve a very small outpost of the British Empire in the South Atlantic. So the decision to employ American medium-range nuclear missiles in Western Europe and the reaction to that decision was the entire reason behind the plot of Octopussy. Believe it or not, though, the deployment decision was made not by Ronald Reagan. The decision was initially made in December 1979, more than a year before Reagan came to power. At that time, 1979-1980, there was a big concern within NATO countries about a Soviet military buildup in conventional forces, armies, tanks, etc. And the thinking was that the Western powers could not hope to match Soviet conventional buildup, so the gap had to be filled with nuclear weapons, not conventional ones. The concern with Soviet military was exacerbated by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, the same month the decision to deploy the Pershing II missile in Europe was made. So concern over Soviet military expansion was part of what brought Ronald Reagan into the White House in the first place. Needless to say, Reagan saw dealing with this threat as the major project of his first term. In October 1981, the Defense Intelligence Agency began producing a yearly report called Soviet Military Power, which compiled what defense analysts knew about Soviet military forces. In reality, Soviet military power was a propaganda brochure designed to drum up public support for sharply increased U.S. defense spending. I vividly remember these Soviet military power magazines. In the early 80s, my father, a career Air Force officer, was stationed at SAC, Strategic Air Command, and it was a big deal when Soviet military power came out every year. My dad always brought it home the first day of its publication, and this was a slick, glossy book filled with eye-popping illustrations of Russians popping off nukes and waging war pretty much everywhere, especially in landscapes that resembled Western and Central Europe. Not very subtle and not meant to be. Reagan himself was carried away by military planners and defense interests. In 1983, a small group of conservative advisors sold Reagan on a bizarre plan called the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, supposedly a network of space-based weapons satellites programmed to shoot down Soviet missiles in the event of a nuclear exchange. In reality, these weapons did not exist, at least the satellite weapons I'm talking about, and they were not feasible to develop. But Reagan so fell in love with the idea that no one could shake him out of it, not even Mikhail Gorbachev, who failed to get Reagan to give up Star Wars at the Reykjavik summit in 1986, and has proved a major stumbling block in U.S.-Soviet relations. Incidentally, many of the same consultants who worked on pushing the Strategic Defense Initiative later turned up in the 90s in fossil fuel industry think tanks pushing, guess what, denial of climate change. How perfect is that? In fact, climate change is interrelated with defense questions in this same period, 1981 to 83, when Octopussy was being made. It was climate scientists studying global warming with computer models who discovered that a major nuclear exchange between the US and the Soviet Union would pump so much particulate matter into the atmosphere that it would cause a nuclear winter, likely resulting in the extinction of the human race and just about everything else on Earth. Astronomer Carl Sagan, who had a lot of public cachet as a result of his popular science series Cosmos, which was syndicated on PBS in 1980, he worked on the nuclear winter project and was a notable enemy of the cottage industry pushing SDI and nuclear deployment, in much the same way that more recently, climate change scientists have been demonized by industry-funded groups dedicated to denying man-made global warming. Anyway, back to the story of the missiles. This is related to Octopussy, I assure you. The deployment of the Pershing II missiles was massively unpopular in Europe. Beginning in the fall of 1981, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in Britain, Germany, France, and other countries to protest the deployment and nuclear weapons in general. It was a ferocious political firestorm and demonstrated that the majority of the public of these countries, including Britain, were very much opposed to the deployments and the defense buildup. This is the central idea that Octopussy seizes on. In the film, General Orlov intends to smuggle a nuclear weapon onto an American Air Force base in West Germany, using a traveling circus owned by Octopussy, that's the Maude Adams character, as a Trojan horse, basically. So when the explosion happens, the idea, covered by a mere 2 lines of dialogue by Roger Moore, is that everyone will assume that it was an American Pershing II missile which accidentally blew up. Then, public pressure in these countries, already tipping against the deployment, would become irresistible in demanding unilateral withdrawal of American nuclear forces in Europe. With the nuclear deterrent gone, General Orlov is now supposedly free to go driving his little green tanks all over Europe, trigger Reagan's red tide scenario. Octopussy presents this scenario pretty much uncritically. It's hard not to take it as a fairly wholesale endorsement of the Reagan-Thatcher geopolitical view of the Soviets and their intentions, and the hint that those pesky peaceniks marching through the streets of Berlin and London are easily manipulated fools who don't know what's in their own best interest. That's an uncommonly harsh judgment from a Bond film. In addition to the plot based on the red tide scenario, Octopussy appears to have a wholly secondary plot involving Bond traveling to India, and the villain of this storyline is Kemal Khan, played by character actor Louis Jourdan, a really unfortunate casting choice. Again, in a single line of throwaway dialogue, the film tells us who Khan is. He's an exiled Afghan prince. Now, this is an interesting nod to what was going on in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Afghanistan did have a ruling dynasty once upon a time, and many African royalty did call themselves Khan, so at least the character's name was reasonably accurate. The Afghan monarchy was overthrown in 1973, and a republic was proclaimed. That government was itself overthrown in 1978 by a communist regime. A power struggle broke out within that regime, and in order to prop up the faction in that struggle that was allied with Moscow, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. This is a vastly oversimplified explanation of a very complex series of events. I'll leave a longer discussion of the Soviet-Afghan War to another video, specifically the one discussing The Living Daylights, the Bond film that involves the Soviet-Afghan War. So the idea of an exiled Afghan prince living in India is a pretty cool setup for a Bond villain, but the producers, in my view, totally wasted that idea by casting character actor Louis Jourdan, a Frenchman, in that role. At least the next time that an Afghan villain comes up in the series, that being Kamran Shah in The Living Daylights, the producers had the good sense to cast Art Malik, an actor born in Pakistan. In my opinion, Louis Jourdan as Kemal Khan is one of the worst villains in the entire Bond series. In fact, just about every role in Octopussy is miscast, including James Bond. When Roger Moore began his turn as Bond in 1973, he had a contract to do 3 pictures, which was up after The Spy Who Loved Me. After that, they negotiated on a picture-by-picture basis. In fact, Moore had intended to retire after For Your Eyes Only, but then the news came out that Connery had agreed to return for Never Say Never Again, which would be released at roughly the same time as Octopussy. The producers thought it was the wrong time to take a chance on a new actor, so they lured Moore back again. And it shows. In the number of the action scenes, you can clearly see Roger Moore sucking in his gut, and the stunt doubles are busier than usual. Moore really doesn't have much enthusiasm for the role anymore, echoing Sean Connery's obvious dissatisfaction in his last 2 pictures. The title character is also miscast. Maude Adams returns for her second time as a Bond girl. She had a bit part in The Man with the Golden Gun. But how a Swedish actress is supposed to portray an Indian princess, I will never understand. especially since there was a dazzlingly beautiful Indian-born actress at the height of her popularity at exactly this time. I'm talking about Persis Khambatta, who was best known as playing Ilea on the Star Trek The Motion Picture. Come on, how hard a casting choice is this, guys? I mean, really. I find Octopussy an absolute mess. I've seen the film dozens of times, and I still can't understand what the Red Tide plot and the bomb on the airbase, what that really has to do with the B plot involving Octopussy and all that stuff in India. Who stole the jewels? Did Orlov steal them to pay for the bomb? And who is he paying? Is he paying Khan? How did he get a nuclear bomb? It just doesn't make any sense. I don't get it. I really don't. I don't know. Maybe I'm getting punchy after 13 of these videos. Anyway, I think that's quite enough about Octopussy. In the next video, we finally get to the end of Roger Moore's tenure as Bond, and we go full-on crazy 80s in A View to a Kill. So join me there. Thanks.